Hello everyone, welcome back to a deck profile, me, Chocobilly, and this week I'm going to be looking at Nuke'd. So it's, a fairly obvious mono fire deck, but with a focus on damage buffing. So it includes some pretty generic good fire cards, which you just can't really get rid of in mono fire because they're just that useful. But it includes a lot of the buffing fire cards, maybe excluding a couple that you might have expected as well. But there's a certain element and focus within it of trying to use things like first strike as well. So increasing damage that first strikers might deal, so it means that actually they are more effective attackers and blockers, as well as just being able to increase the general damage output of your abilities and summons and boards in general. So it runs a total of 22 forwards, 2 monsters, which are Jinn, so 24 forwards really, 10 summons and 16 backups. As you can see from the curve here, it's got quite a few 2 CP and 3 CP cards, and then it starts to drop off towards the higher end of the cards, as is pretty standard to be honest. That's one of the best things about Fire, is the fact that most of its effective cards are actually pretty cheap. So we'll start with the forwards. So first up we have Palom, who is just a bit of a lightning rod in Fire because he is pretty harmless for the first couple of turns, but once he gets to that third turn where he can start dealing 8k stuff and he becomes a 7k forward, he becomes a bit more problematic for your opponent. So they may be willing to have him there for a little while, but after that point he will probably die. He's not too hard to kill either, but still the chances are, because he's such a cheap forward, your opponent probably spending more than you have to play him. The one, I would say, exception to this is probably something like Ixion. Ixion is a very, very useful summon, and even in like other elements, is like Earth, for example, or elements that are able to generate or just generate lightning or cast other summons. Running Ixion's really good because a board wipe against Wonder Twins or something like that is, pretty brutal. But still, it's a nice lightning rod all the same. Next up we have Luneth, a generic good fire card. When you go to combat, you get to deal 1k for each fire character you control, but again, with some of the characters you've got on the field, they'll be increasing the damage dealt anyway. So something like Jinn, for example, so maybe you've got Luneth, Jinn, and 3 backups down. You could be dealing 5k, which is then buffed to 6k, which is quite nice. And given the fact that that is every turn without you having to pay a cost for it, that's not too bad in my opinion. Again, pretty easy to kill, but a massive problem for your opponent if left to just kind of sweep their board. And then finally we have Adelard. So, a really good card. It has a really good passive, basically Kuchaspel, to make it so damage dealt by your abilities to forwards opponent controls cannot be reduced. So worth noting that it's only damage dealt by abilities, so it's not damage dealt by forwards, so as in combat damage, or damage dealt by summons. So just bear in mind that Adelard doesn't stop all damage reduction. And obviously got the pay 2 fire. Again, all ability damage is doubled, so not summons and not combat damage. And then jamming thrust, which is a really good S of an S and 2 fire, choose one forward to 10k damage. Yeah, it's really good in my opinion. A nice card just to have on the field, and being able to double a lot of these further effects is going to be really useful, and I'll show you what I mean. So Fang, bit of a weird one. As I mentioned earlier, I wanted to try and have an element of first strike in the deck, and there are some decent first strikers in Fire, but some of them kind of required a bit more either damage to be dealt or just another means of being able to give them first strike. So running something like Fan, if you control 2 or more 13 characters, Fan gains first strike. So she includes herself, and then you've got the Lebro backup. So you do really require Lebro to be on the field for her to be any good. Where has she gone? But if she is, then she is an 8k first striker, which isn't too bad for a 3 CP. And then if you have something on the field like, say, Jinn, so the 5 forwards you control deal damage, their damage is increased by 1000. So that would mean that Fang then becomes a 9k first striker. And there's loads of other means of being able to buff the damage that Fang does, not to mention the fact that you can combo this with other abilities or just summons. Next, we've got Iroha. So if a fire character you control deals damage to a forward, the damage increases by 1000 instead. So there are quite a few damage increasing cards in this deck, but most of them operate differently and they buff different things, and that can be really confusing. So for example, we have Adelard, who can double ability damage dealt. We have Iroha, who doubles damage that a fire character deals, so that can be combat or ability damage. and then that also extends to, you know, your backups and your monsters as well. Then we've got something like Ifrit, which increases the damage that a character or a summon does. Oh, sorry, a summon or an ability of a character. So not the combat damage of that character, only their abilities. And then you've got Vermilion Bird Lassie, who increases summon damage, and Jin, who increases forward damage. So they all operate a little bit differently and can all be really confusing. So you have to make sure that you're making the calculations correct. Basically, this is a great deck to be able to refine your calculative abilities, because it's going to be a nightmare, especially if your opponent is running some means of damage mitigation as well, because it is when their forward receives damage, or it's the forward receiving damage, that gets to choose how damage replacement effects stack. So if they have damage reduction and then you've got damage increasing, the forward, or the character, sorry, the owner of the card that has receiving damage gets to choose how these things stack. So it's just even more of a nightmare. So yeah, fun. But yeah, Iroha increases the fire character's damage, and then she can dull herself to deal 1,000 to something as well. So basically, with herself on the field, provided she survives and her ability gets resolved, she'll deal 2k to something. You use Adelard, that can become 4k. You've got Jin on the field, that can become 5k. So there's lots of different ways of being able to increase damage that Iroha might be doing. Firion, so if you have 3 or more fire backups, he gains haste. If you have 5 or more fire backups, he gains plus 2,000 power and first strike. And again, just a nice way to be able to gain first strike. The reason I chose this Firion over the other Legend Firion, where you pay a crystal upon entry to then gain first strike plus 1,000, draw a card, and I think maybe haste as well, is because you require the crystal to do that. And even though you have Cyan to be able to get you a Samurai, which then allows you to get crystal, that's a lot of different chains just to be able to facilitate Firion's effects. I'd rather just be able to get to 5 backups and then use Firion. And if you've got LeBron on the field with 5 backups, he's actually a 10k first striker, which is pretty decent. The only thing to really bear in mind is the fact that it's really easy to break forwards these days, and there isn't a huge amount of protection in this deck outside of something like Amaterasu. So you need to be mindful of the fact that you might think to yourself, oh, I've got one forward that's 10k with first strike, that's going to be a nightmare for my opponent to get through. But then if they play Lulu onto the field, cast a summon, your forward is now only 5k, still with the buffs. So, you know, a 5k plus the 2 for the 5 backups, and then the 1 means it's still 8k, but it might put them within range of another killing ability. So just bear in mind that fact. Next up, we have Bahamut. So if you have 3 or more fire summons in the break zone, he gains plus 2,000 power, and if you have 7 or more fire summons in the break zone, when Bahamut attacks, deal 5k to all the forwards your opponent controls. There are 10 summons in the game, so, you know, being able to get to that shouldn't be too hard. And then you also have a fair few, well, you've got 6 Bahamut summons as well, and they can be used to pay for Bahamut's S ability. So Impulse, an S and 1 fire, deal 4,000 damage to all the forwards your opponent controls, and the Mega Flare, an S and a Dull, choose one forward, deal 9k damage. But Impulse, for example, or just the attack ability, if you have 7 summons in the break zone, to deal either 5k or 4k to the board, use that alongside something like Adelard, and you are dealing a lot of damage to the board. Obviously, something like that alongside Squall, for example. So say you've got 7 summons in the break zone with Bahamut, and then you attack with Squall, you'll be dealing 9k to the board already. So pretty nasty. And yeah, just a nice card, to be honest, in my opinion. I think it's quite fun, and be able to use his S abilities a couple of times. I mean, you might be able to, I don't know, use the S, pay a fire, deal 4k, then do it immediately again for fairly cheap. You know, I don't think it's the worst thing in the world. Next up, we have Squall, generic fire card, really, really good. Not much more I need to say. Ifrit, Lord of the Inferno. So when he enters, you get to deal 4k to 2 forwards opponent controls. He's in the EX. However, if he is on the field when that resolves, then it actually gets buffed to 5k, which I think isn't too bad. And then if your summon or ability of a character you control deals damage to a forward, the damage increases by 1,000 instead. So summon or ability of a character. So if you've got a backup dealing damage, that's decent. If Jin were to deal damage to something somehow through an ability, then that would be fine. But Jin actually you know, blocking the damage isn't increased that way through Ifrit's effect. It would be increased through its own effect, but not through Ifrit, just to make things more confusing. But I quite like it, and I'm running 3 Ifrit and 2 Susanoo, along with 3 Amaljar backups. So Amaljars get reactivated when you play a primal, a fire primal onto the field, and with Ifrit, you can dole them to deal 2k to a forward. So it might be a case that you play Ifrit onto the field with 2 Amaljar, but you don't use the Amaljar to pay. You can then dole 2 Amaljar to deal 4k, and then they get reactivated, and then you can dole them again to deal a further 4k, which might tie in nicely to the 5k that Ifrit is actually doing upon entry. Rain, so he gets his cost is reduced for each fire backup you control, so he can become a 1 CP forward at 7k, which is really nice. And then when he enters the field or attacks, choose 1 forward, opponent control, deal it 1000 damage for each backup you control. So again, at 5, it would mean that you're dealing 5. So really, really good standard fire card. Damage 3 gains haste. So maybe you play Rain onto the field for 1 CP, he'll deal 5 upon entry. You pay 2 for Adelard, he's now dealing 10 upon entry, and then if you're damage 3, he can attack again and deal a further 10k to something else, which for 3 CP is brutal. And then finally, Susanoo, just a generic good fire card, gets to board wipe, will probably kill everything on your field as well. I don't think anything really can survive. I mean, we've got Lebro on the field, but even something like Firion, who's one of the biggest forwards, you'd go down to 4 backups, at which point Firion loses buff, so he'd still only be an 8k. You could potentially survive Bahamut if you have enough fire summons in the break zone, so there's maybe a way there. Similarly with Squall as well, but there's lots of prerequisites to be able to make sure that all these forwards are bigger, so chances are Susanoo is going to be killing things as well. But again, it's Fire's Shantoto at the end of the day, so probably worth having, and it works nicely with the Amaljars, so it means you get a bit more cost efficiency there as well. Next up, I'm going to go for Jin. So yeah, 5 forward you control deals damage to a forward. The damage becomes 1000 instead, and then it can become a 7k first striker forward. So he basically is an 8k attacker or blocker. And then if you combine that with something like Iroha, then that means it becomes a 9k blocker. Again, doesn't work with Ifrit or Adelard though, because they only increase ability damage. So just be mindful of that as well. A card I didn't include in this deck was the Manasvin Warmech, just because I think that increases, if a character deals damage, increase it by 2, so it's literally any form of damage. But the problem is they just come in, they cost 2, and then it's also 2 from your hand, and then you have to dole them and pay 1, so it's really 3. They obviously are reusable, but they are just, I think I'd rather have a static effect like Jin on the field, who also is a pretty decent forward, you know, with First Strike, which again was another focus of the deck. So just having Jin here I think was more preferential, and I'd rather have more summons than I would have something like the Manasvin Warmechs. So moving on to the summons. So first up we have Ifrit, so deal 8k to something, and then all the fire forwards you control gain plus 2000 power to the end of the turn. So maybe a good way to combo Susanoo to be able to kill something that might have survived Susanoo, but also Ifrit would make it so that your own forwards will survive Susanoo's effect as well. So it might be a case that you play Susanoo onto the field, put a forward into the break zone, and then you get to maybe stack it so that the backups will reactivate, or the Amaljar backups will reactivate to cast the Ifrit first before Susanoo deals its damage, so your forwards get to survive and you haven't paid as much beforehand, and you're still getting to kill hopefully all your opponent's forwards. Amaterasu, it's Amaterasu, what do I need to say? Bahamut, so choose 2 forwards to divide 10,000 damage among them, and if you're at 5 points of damage, divide 15,000 damage among them instead. So really, really good for only 4k, for only 4 CP, sorry. So the damage dealt by Bahamut will be increased by Ifrit, Lord of the Inferno, and Vermilion Bird Lassie Kaituna. What's more is that Vermilion Bird Lassie Kaituna, when played onto the field, can search as Bahamut and play it. So if you play her fairly late game, which wouldn't be ideal, but still, you play her late game to go search this, you might be able to deal 15k, which actually, because it's being divided between 2 forwards, each instance of that damage is being increased by 1. So let's say you go 7,000 to one forward, 8,000 to another, that then gets increased to 8,000 and 9,000. If you have Ifrit on the field, then that will again be increased, so then you'll be dealing 9,000 and 10,000, which is really, really good. And then Bahamut gets cheaper when you're at 5 damage. It's an EX burst and ultimately deals 8k something. 8k isn't huge, but again, Vermilion Birdless Sea Kaituna can make it so that it starts dealing 9k, which, 9k, which I think is pretty decent. Something of note as well, actually, before I continue. Actually, I'll finish the summons and I'll talk. And then you got this Bahamut. So before paying the cost to cast Bahamut, you can remove 10 fire characters and or category 10 characters in your break zone from the game to reduce the cost required to cast Bahamut by 5. So it can become a 1 CP summon, and then choose on forward to get 10,000 damage. If it's put from the field to the break zone, remove it from the game instead. So yeah, you don't really need to worry about the buff damage, the damage increase for this card, because it's going to be absolutely nuking something. But still, very easy to be able to get things out of your break zone just to make it cheap. I've only included 1 in the deck. You could probably include 2 if you wanted to, but I just thought, because of the fact that to pay that cost is probably not going to be happening instantly, so either it's going to be discarded early or kept in hand to eventually just nuke something. So yeah, not incredible, but still really good to be able to just deal 10k to something outright. This Bahamut can do that as well. Like, you can cast it and then choose to only 1 forward, deal that 1 forward 10k, which is still really good. But to be able to do it for only 1 CP with this Bahamut late game might surprise your opponent, and is, to be honest, perfectly fine in my opinion. Just be mindful of the fact that you might be funding an X death when it comes onto the field. Now, the one thing I wanted to note is things like Jin, for example. If a 5 forward you control deals damage to a forward, the damage increases by 1,000 head. It's something to, a very important part of that phrase is 5 forward you control deals damage. Let's say, hypothetically, you were, Luneth were to stack his ability and he was going to deal 7k to something, but then you put Jin on the field, that would then become 8k. If your opponent, in response to Luneth's ability stacking, kills Luneth, Luneth will be put from the field into the break zone. Now, obviously, the damage he would do would go down by 1, because that's 1 less fire character on the field. However, you no longer control Luneth, which means that it will not get the damage buff from Jin either. And that's an important part, because actually you've now missed out on a 2k damage buff, and that applies to a lot of the cards in this game as well. So if an ability of a character you control, again he says control, Adelard, during this turn, if your ability damage deals damage to a forward, double the damage instead. That one's fine. That one doesn't say by a forward you control. So during this turn, if your ability deals damage to a forward, double the damage instead. So it's a better variant, obviously costs more, but just bear in mind that some others like Jin and Ifrit require you to control that character at resolution for the damage buff to actually happen. And then finally move on to the backups. So, 2 Samurais. I've gone for this Samurai instead of the crystal generating one, just because it's a nice entry effect to be able to choose a forward, give it 2k and Brave. So you could combo that with maybe something like Susanoo to make it so that you choose a forward, gains 2k and Brave, then play Susanoo, put the Samurai back into the break zone, and then the forward that would have previously died Susanoo survives, but also just a really nice buff, and to give something Brave. Again, with first strikes, means that that becomes even more of a problem. And then at damage 5, you can put Samurai into the break zone, choose a 5 forward, it gains plus 2,000 power and Brave, but just really nice defensive mechanism to be able to, again, choose a forward on block and be able to use that effect. Some people might forget what the Samurai does, because there are a lot of Samurais out there, so they may attack with a forward, you take a point of damage, go to 5 damage, they attack with a following forward, you then use Samurai to maybe buff something like Fang with first strike to then make her a 10k first striker, and then their forward dies. Next up, Kuchaspel. It's Kuchaspel, Year and Fire. What more is there to say? Amulja, again, you have 3 Ifrits and 2 Susanoos, so I just wanted to kind of include them, because ultimately dulling to choose 1 forward, deal 1,000 damage, you can only use ability to control Fire Primal, is pretty decent if you're getting those damage buffs. Again, you just want to make sure that you're getting the damage buffs off of the right characters. So Jin, for example, will not be buffing it, because if a Fire forward you control deals damage, I know I'm going on about this, but it will become very confusing actually in the game. So Jin, if a Fire forward you control deals damage to the forward, increase the damage. Doesn't increase Amulja. However, something like Adelard, if ability damage deals, and then again, Ifrit, if an ability of a character you control deals damage, so it will increase the damage. So Amulja can deal quite a bit of damage. You can also use Amulja's Reactivation just to pay for something like Adelard, which is really, really good, because ultimately you might pay the 5 to play Ifrit, leave the 2 Amulja open, dull Amulja, then to pay for Adelard's effect. That then goes on the stack. Pretty decent. Varn, so when you control, when Varn enters the field, choose one forward, your opponent controls, deal it 3,000 damage. If you've cast 3 or more cards this turn, deal it 8,000 damage instead. So actually, it's not too bad. And what's good is the fact that Varn can be the third cast. Some cards, it doesn't work. So for example, Atomos and Rosa in Wind, they cannot be the third or second cast to be able to get the reactivation. Varn can, because the way his is worded, when Varn enters the field, choose one forward opponent controls, and then it checks to see how many cards you've cast, which means he can be the third. And then Red Spiral, which is a decent S, choose one forward, deal it 7k damage. Again, something like Adelard or Ifrit will increase the damage. Lebro, Mono Fire, First Strikers, just making it so that, to be honest, that 1k damage power increase is really effective, to be honest. A lot of cards don't consider that sort of thing these days because the power buffers generally aren't played too much, but with a lot of cards like Lulu being played with power setting, it means that it makes it a little bit harder for them to get around something like that. It means that casting a Brynhilde, for example, with Lulu on the field isn't an insta-kill. Muti. When Muti enters the field, search for one fire summon, add to your hand, so it's nice to be able to get Amatras if you want, but also gets you a Bahamut. When you cast card named Bahamut, activate Muti. Again, quite nice. If you are casting this one for only 1 CP, it means that it's cost you effectively nothing other than the card out of a hand and the cards from your break zone. Oh, and also, it's when you cast a card named Bahamut, so it also reactivates off of this Bahamut as well. So another means of reactivation in the deck, which means that you then may be able to stack things for Adelard's effect or other cards' effects as well. Mutsuki, so I absolutely love this card, and I had a lightning fire, just outright break deck, dealing a little bit of chip damage with fire, then outright breaking with lightning, and this card is a lot of fun, because when a forward your opponent controls is put from the field into the break zone, activate Mutsuki, and it's really good because you can then dull her, choose one forward opponent controls, deal it 1,000 damage. Just constantly doing that little bit of chip damage is surprisingly effective. Obviously, you do have stuff like Amalja on the field, but Amaljas get reactivated through a Primal entering. Muti gets reactivated through a Bahamut being cast. Mutsuki gets reactivated through something dying. So actually, it could be a case of like you've got, I don't know, you pay 2 Amalja and Mutsuki, and then discard a card from hand to play Ifrit. Ifrit comes in, kills 2 things. You then get to activate Amalja and Mutsuki. So actually, you've only paid 2 CP for Ifrit, which isn't too bad. But Mutsuki's effect can stack, so even when she's active. So it might be a case that you break something with Mutsuki, you can then dull her, or it might be a case that you deal damage to, or you're going to deal damage to something, you then dull Mutsuki to then reactivate her to then continue to deal damage, to keep on breaking multiple things. And if you use that something along the lines of Ifrit or Adelard to double the damage being dealt, you can start to really just ping things around and kill a lot of things whilst reactivating Mutsuki. And then finally, Vermilion Birdless Sea Cartuna. When she enters the field, you get to search a summon of 4 and play it onto the field. Now there are 5 summons in total. You've got this Bahamut, which I think is a really good one to choose, because even at the base damage, 5k to 2 different forwards becomes 6k to 2 different forwards, but you can obviously change it if you wanted to make it so it's maybe 7k to something else and 6k to something else, 5k to something else. See, even when I'm looking at the deck, it becomes so awkward to try and work out the calculations for these things. But either way, Vermilion Birdless Sea Cartoon I think has got a good place in this deck, because dealing lots of damage to lots of forwards with summons is quite effective, and that is the deck. So there could be something to be said about maybe throwing Braska into the deck. You've got a lot of summons in the deck, so just discarding to deal 7k to something. If you've got Jin or Adelard on the field, or some other damage buffing forward, Iroha for example, be able to make it so it deals 8k or 9k becomes even better. And the fact that you are then discarding to pay for this Bahamut, so then it might deal 4k upon attack as well, is 5k on attack, sorry, is pretty decent as well. There's loads of different decent fire cards you can throw into this deck to make it good. I just wanted to focus on some of my personal favorite cards, so things like Mutsuki and Firion, and some of the other Bahamuts as well that don't get played as often. But yeah, to be honest, there's so many good fire cards out there, which if I'd said that, I don't know, 6 sets ago, then you probably would have called me crazy. But actually now fire is incredibly strong, mono fire especially. So there's loads of good cards. So let me know what cards you might have thrown into this deck to make it a bit different. I mean, the obvious choice is probably throwing in a Cyan to then search yourself for Samurai, which is a nice bit of backup consistency, which this deck does lose out on. There isn't really any, in fact, I don't think there's any search in this deck outside of Muti searching you a fire summon. So, you know, generally mono fire decks run at least one SARS backup EX burst, which searches your summon, which is always nice, but, you know, it varies depending on what it is you're playing. And let me know what you'd throw into the deck anyway. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Stay safe, be lucky, and I'll see you in the next video.